Today is September 28th, Wednesday. On October 10th, 2008, as it happened, there was a previous scheduled meeting in Washington of the G7 industrial countries, the seven largest industrial countries, and the central bank governors and the finance ministers of those seven countries met in Washington. Now I will tell you a deep dark secret. These big high profile international meetings are usually a terrible bore because much of the work is done in advance by the staff. We have a discussion, but the communique has already been written by the staff, and in most cases, what happens at the meeting is fairly routine. This was not one of those boring meetings. We essentially tore up the agenda and discussed what we should do. How should we work together to stop this crisis that was threatening the global financial system? In the end, we came up with a statement of principles that was written from scratch based on some Fed proposals. Among those principles were that we would work together to prevent the failure of any more systematically important financial institutions. This was after Lehman Brothers had failed. We would make sure that banks and other financial institutions had access to funding from central banks and capital from governments. We would work to restore depositor confidence and investor confidence, and then we would cooperate as much as possible to normalize credit markets. This was a global agreement, and the following week, the United Kingdom was the first to announce a comprehensive program to stabilize its banking system. The United States announced major steps to put together into our banks, and so on. So a lot happened in the next couple of days after this meeting. To show you how effectively this worked, Figure 24 graphs the interest rate charged on overnight loans between banks. The interbank interest rate normally, the overnight interest rate between banks is extremely low, far less than 1%, because banks need some place to park their money overnight, and they have a lot of confidence that it is safe to lend to another large bank overnight. As you can see, starting in 2007, banks lost confidence in one another, which is shown by the increase in the rates they charged one another to make loans. For example, in 2007, you begin to see the pressures as house prices began to fall, and there were increasing concerns about the quality of mortgage securities and the financial soundness of firms. In March 2008, you can see another little peak around the time Bear Stearns was forced to sell itself. That does not look like much in comparison to what happened later, but that was a very difficult period. It was a period of quite sharp movements in the financial markets and in funding markets. Now, look what happened in response to Bear Stearns' liquidity problems. There was an enormous spike in interbank market rates, and probably not much lending was taking place even at those high rates. This indicated that suddenly there was no trust whatsoever, even between the largest financial institutions, because nobody Nobody. Because nobody knew who was going to be next, who was going to fail, who was going to come under funding pressure. Look what happened after the international announcements. Within a few days, we began to see a reduction in funding pressures, and by early January, there was an enormous improvement in the funding pressures in the banking system. This is a great example of international cooperation, and it illustrates the point that this was not just a US phenomenon. It was not just US policy. It was not just the Federal Reserve. It really was a global cooperative effort, particularly between the United States and Europe. The Fed played an important role, however, in providing liquidity, making sure that the panic was controlled. I will talk briefly about this in general, and then I will present two case studies that will illustrate some of the issues. The Federal Reserve has a facility called the discount window, which is used routinely to provide short-term funding to banks. May be a bank that finds itself short of funding at the end of the day. It wants to borrow overnight. It has collateral with the Fed. Based on that collateral, it can borrow overnight at the discount rate, which is the interest rate the Fed charges. So the discount window, which allows the Fed to lend to banks, is always operative. No extraordinary steps were needed to lend to banks. The Fed always lend to banks. We did make some modification in order to reassure banks about the availability of credit. And to get more liquidity into the system, we extended the maturity of discount window loans, which were normally overnight loans. We made them longer term, and we had auctions of discount window funds in which firms bid on how much interest they would pay. The idea there was, by having a fixed amount that we were auctioning, we would at least assure ourselves that we got a lot of cash into the system. The point here is that the discount window, which is the Fed's usual lender of last resort facility lending to banks, was operative, and we used it aggressively to make sure that banks had access to cash to try to calm the panic. But our financial system is a lot more complicated than the one that existed when the Fed was created in 1913. We have many different kinds of financial institutions in markets now. And as I said, the crisis was like an old-fashioned bank crisis, but it happened to all different kinds of firms and in different industrial contexts. So the Fed had to go beyond the discount window. We had to create a whole bunch of other programs, special liquidity and credit facilities that allowed us to make loans to other kinds of financial institutions on the Bezet's principle that providing liquidity to firms that are suffering from loss of funding is the best way to calm the panic. But these loans were secured by collateral. We were not taking chances with taxpayers' money, but the cash was going not just to banks, but also more broadly into the system. Again, the purpose of this was to enhance the stability of the financial system and get credit flows moving again. Let me emphasize that this is the traditional lender of last resort function of central banks that has been around for hundreds of years. What was different was that it took place in a different institutional context than just the traditional banking context.